Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My colleague Gabby is just going to let you see the speakers, so we're going to stop sharing the screen just now. But just as we do that, we just want to say welcome to everyone to today's RegWatch from Merkle Science. Today, our fantastic panel will be sharing some insider insights on the ever-changing crypto regulatory landscape here in the UK. We're going to talk about the fight against crypto crime. We're going to learn from what's going on in other jurisdictions and talk about the path to compliance for UK-based crypto businesses. We are so privileged to be joined by this fantastic group of experts, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So we have received a lot of great questions in advance of today's session, and thank you so much to everyone who has submitted them. We will try and work through as many of those as possible in the questions to the panel, but we do have an awful lot to get through. Please do add any additional questions as we're going along in the Q&A section that you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we will try our very best to get to them by the end of the session. If you don't get your question answered, this session will be recorded in full, and we'll be sending that out to everybody who's registered for the event. And in addition to that, that email will include a guide to the crypto regulations that has been prepared by Cummings, Pepperdine and Merkle Science for your reference. And also in that email will include all of the contact details for our speakers, so you can contact them and ask your question after the fact. So with no further ado, I want to give the panel the opportunity to introduce themselves. So perhaps ladies first. Claire, if I can turn over to you and you can do an intro.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Claire Cummings and I'm a solicitor working in the UK, and I'm the managing partner of Cummings Pepperdine. And we supply tax and so we supply legal and regulatory advice to people in the crypto area, also a bit of tax advice for people in the UK. And our specialism is very much in crypto regulation and also structuring custody and the issues around it. I'm also on the advisory committee of RegWatch, which is the only FCA regulated exchange here in the UK.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Claire. And Ian, perhaps over to you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for hosting today, Natalie, and welcome to all the delegates. My name is Ian Taylor. I chair CryptoUK, the UK's trade body, advocating for fair and balanced regulation. We have 60 members at present and growing rather rapidly, and look forward to a good discussion on all things regulation today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. And Nathan.
Hey everyone, pleasure to be here. My name is Nathan. I'm a partner at XReg Consulting. So the reason we're called XReg is because the founding team are all former regulators. So myself, I was a regulator in the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission. It's interesting fact about Gibraltar is that it was one of the first jurisdictions to actually bring in a regulatory framework for crypto businesses. So we were licensing and supervising crypto firms here in Gibraltar for a while. We decided to set up XReg together to really bring this or to provide this expertise to clients, and we work with both the public sector, where we work with governments, policymakers, regulators. We've done work for FIUs, law enforcement agencies globally, and we also offer services to private sector clients as well. And we work with some of the leading crypto businesses out there.
So a really quiet time for you guys, I would imagine, Nathan.
Yeah, extremely.
Fantastic. And finally, we're joined by Tom, last but not least, from our host, Merkle Science. So I'll hand over to him.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and it's a pleasure to be here. So my name's Tom Lowe from Merkle Science, and I'm director here. And Merkle Science, we're a blockchain compliance company, and we help crypto blockchain companies, banks, financial institutions, law enforcement organizations stay ahead of blockchain and crypto compliance. A little bit of background about me is I've spent the last 10 plus years in enterprise RegTech solutions. I'm an investor myself, and the reason why I got into this space is I have a specific aim to make sure that every investor is protected. And as you can imagine, a conversation around UK regulation is quite exciting for me, at least anyway. So great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. That's awesome. Quite exciting for a lot of people by the looks of our attendees list, which is a very cool club to be in, I'm sure. So from to take things forward, really the UK has seen tectonic shifts in the crypto regulation landscape in the last 12 months. And we'd be interested to know from the panel's perspective, what would you identify as the most significant pieces of legislation that our audience and wider industry participants should be concerned about? And Claire, maybe over to you first for this one.
Yes, I think the place I would focus my attention on here is action and coming out of the FCA, because I'm the solicitor, I work in the UK, so the FCA is our regulator here. And I think the two main things that have come about are the requirement for people who are involved with crypto assets to register under the 5th Money Laundering Directive. Now, I know that isn't, the 5th Money Laundering Directive is, applies wider, but it has been taken by the FCA. I think it might be worth, as we go on, talking about the speed at which that registration for 5th Money Laundering Directive is happening within the UK. But I would also say that as part of the need for that to come in, there also has been post-Brexit a temporary transition permission as well. And I think what the FCA is trying to say there is that we will apply anti-money laundering. We want to be a good regulator, but we do want to have everybody in here. Now, as part of that, I think I would also bring into the picture on a more day-to-day basis the issue of the FCA banning marketing of crypto derivatives to the retail market. I'd make the point that these are just the derivatives they're talking about, and they do extend to exchange traded notes. But I think that's an important first step. I think there's a lot of lobbying going on to see where we can go with that, and it reminds me kind of the early days of hedge funds and the fear of derivatives there. I think there are other points to cover, but those are my wider FCA points, and it's very much watch this space and see how it develops.
Definitely, and I think, Ian, from your perspective, certainly I know you've got over 60 members of CryptoUK and who are coming to you quite often in terms of their engagement with regulators. What's been at the forefront of your membership's mind in the last 12 months?
Well, perhaps if I set the scene of where we are in the UK, the industry has been asking for regulatory clarity for a number of years. That is here now, and with that has brought a increased adoption from both institutions and from consumers and retail folks as well. Obviously, price action drives that too. So what we have, as previously mentioned, is the money laundering regime, which was spun up at the beginning of 2020. That is still in play right now, with a number of companies still waiting to see if their applications get authorized. And 3 applications have been also 3 companies have had their applications accepted out of some 200 in this regime. So that's number one. That deals with economic crime. Number 2 is from financial promotions. So the government closed the consultation at the end of last year, with basically it hasn't been released, the results of this open consultation yet. We expect this in the second half of 2021, but the expectation is that all crypto promotions would need to be signed off by a regulated entity, and each promotion would have to be signed off by the FCA. So one would assume there's quite a lot of resource requirement there at the FCA on top of what they're involved in already. And then the third prong, which is just fairly recent, a consultation closed, bringing stable coins into the regulatory perimeter in the UK. And these are systemic stable tokens, the terminology government uses, that would potentially be used in the UK economy for purchasing goods and services. So this is really to future-proof the likes of Facebook's DM, or we've just recently seen that the stablecoin USDC partner with Visa. So that's the clarity we have. The burning issues for our members are the registration with the FCA. There is somewhat of a logjam. We did write an open letter to the Chancellor. We've had a response from that recently, which we'll share shortly, but it is still a problem, and we are working as best we can behind the scenes to try and release the logjam and allow firms that are not allowed to open up trading yet, that weren't grandfathered in, to start doing business in the UK.
Yeah, and I mean, that is so important. There's so many firms that are in that kind of regulatory limbo today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go. But Nathan, from your perspective, it's interesting to see the comparisons between what the UK regulators are focusing on and what's going on in the rest of the world. And I know obviously you have a very global view in the work that you do at XReg. How do we measure up to what other regulatory bodies are doing?
Yeah, so I guess maybe to set the scene, the majority of the activity in crypto regulation really is very much focused on anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing. And this is really coming from the Financial Action Task Force. So the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF for short, they're a big intergovernmental body where effectively countries group together and set these global standards for money laundering, terrorist financing, and recently proliferation financing. It was back in June 19 when they issued guidance. I think it was October 18 when they formally announced that virtual assets and virtual asset service providers needed to be regulated for AML CFT. And then they issued some follow-up guidance the following year in June. So what they did effectively is that they've mandated that all countries now need to bring in these types of frameworks. So internationally, really, before this happened, anyone that's been in crypto for some time will understand that it was very much the Wild West. There was no regulation. People could do whatever they want. But that was really a key turning point where countries now have to bring in these regimes, or they face the risk of being grey-listed, blacklisted, as you can see certain jurisdictions do if they don't up their game. So I guess as a result of that, we've seen jurisdictions implement these types of regulatory regimes. The UK being one of them. As you probably know, in Europe, the regimes are brought in through anti-money laundering directives and potentially in the future some anti-money laundering regulation. I guess in terms of the UK, they were pretty good in the sense of the scope of the crypto asset framework in the UK. It goes over and above the scope of AMLD. So they've brought in certain activities in terms of what a virtual asset service provider should be before Europe, and they're one of the jurisdictions that, I guess the first, because there's still quite a lot of countries that need to catch up to bring in this type of crypto asset registration. Which is great. So I think the UK they have upped their game and they are taking these FATF requirements seriously. That being said, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's new guidance that's been brought out recently that we'll probably discuss soon. There's the travel rule as well. So there's still work to be done, I guess, in terms of global compliance, especially aligning to the FATF standards.
And I think we almost have this perfect storm that's driving that increase of guidance that's coming from outside of the UK in the form of FATF. We've got the regulator has cited consumer protection. We've got increased institutional adoption, a bull market. We have
exactly. It's a perfect combination of things. And one of the points I wanted to make is that really the FATF was pushing for money laundering, terrorist financing provisions. If you think about financial services regulation, there's a lot of other stuff that could be applied to crypto businesses that could protect consumers and achieve results. So again, things like consumer protection, prudential requirements, there's a whole load of other stuff that really hasn't been focused by governments or policymakers, because the immediate concern is to meet their FATF requirements and to please the intergovernmental body that looks over them.
Definitely, and I think it's a complex, and we'll get into it in more detail as we go, but it's a very complex issue for a lot of the people on this call, certainly, and definitely the industry as a whole. And in that perfect storm, we've got, as we mentioned, consumer protection, increased adoption, bull market. We've got the perceived risk of versus the fact, perhaps, of high risk volatility and crypto crime that's going on within the space. But it'd be interesting to know, and Tom, I know that Merkle have some data around this, but have we actually seen an uptick in the sophistication and success of crypto crime in the UK? Obviously there's a lot of concern about it and a lot of narrative in the news, etc. But what's actually the activity been like in the last 12 months?
So for us, in terms of what we've seen, I guess kind of looking at the industry, reports of scams relating to cryptocurrency investments have risen by about 57% to, I think the number was about 5,581 in the last 12 months up until December, say, 2020. And that's data from Action Fraud itself. Now, in January, there were 720 cryptocurrency fraud reports in the UK alone, which was double the number, basically the same month last year as well. And victims lost, I believe it was an estimated 113 million last year to criminals and cold callers promoting cryptocurrency investment scams. And as you can imagine, with the bull market as it is at the moment, a lot of people are interested in moving into crypto. And so these scams are just becoming more and more prevalent and add.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, certainly, I know, Ian, you mentioned to us that from a CryptoUK perspective, what do you hear on an anecdotal basis from your members?
If you go onto the FCA website, they have quite a lot of good information regarding, say, cloning websites and specifically a page for crypto asset investment scams. Unfortunately, we are starting to see, and to Tom's point, the increased price of a lot of crypto assets has really put a great amount of focus. And so let's say not so crypto savvy investors are starting to diversify their portfolio and want to have exposure to Bitcoin, for example, and other crypto assets, but not quite fully understand how it works and who to go to that is a more reputable place to purchase. And just from our hello at crypto.uk inbox, we're starting to see a massive uptick in folks that are being scammed. And there's lots of ways that we can, as an industry, help to educate and help to stop vulnerable customers being taken advantage of. And a lot of the time, these scams, when we do our due diligence to try and help them out, and we do respond to every communication we receive, is to really provide information. And to that point, we are working on developing a page on our website to help educate to the questions that the individuals should be asking themselves when they're looking to get involved. And lots of the times, it's not crypto that is really the issue. It's generally somebody hiding behind crypto. So it just is a pyramid scheme or a Ponzi scheme or multi-level marketing that are used to confuse consumers. So yeah, it is a problem.
Definitely. And I think, yeah, we absolutely see that both at the level of concern at an institutional and at a retail level is growing, and the reports of crimes, as to Tom's point, has increased. So I think one of the things that we can do as an industry is making sure that we are adhering to the guidance and the regulation, and trying to navigate that compliance landscape is very difficult. So we're keen to ask the panel, with reference specifically to FATF to begin with, and we'll get to more local regulation as we go. There has been much discussion about when the UK will be implementing FATF guidance, and it's been the industry stance that potentially the VASPs are not yet ready for it to be implemented. And I think from your perspective, Tom, and from the data that Merkle Science has, what percentage of VASPs have been making progress in this direction in order to get ready to comply with FATF when it is put into place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And certainly what we've seen in the UK, based on the data, there is 23 of the exchanges that are headquartered in the UK, 14 of them, also effectively 60%, have strict compliance in place and do not allow customers to transact on their platform without KYC, for example. 7 of them, which is about 30%, do have optional KYC and AML, and 2 of them are actually inactive exchanges.
Okay. So yeah, progress is being made in the right direction, but I guess from the audience's perspective, what is the regulators' approach and timeline going to be? You know, how worried do people have to be in terms of getting these processes in place? I know you do spend a lot of time talking with the regulator. You participated in consultations regarding FATF implementation in the UK very recently. What's your perspective on the implementation timeframe and the regulator's approach?
What we should be mindful of is FATF doesn't, its provides guidelines and recommendations. These are not binding. However, an advanced economy really has no choice to implement such things, and it's for the greater good of society. Economic crime obviously has real negative impacts. So the industry generally is in step with the intergovernmental agencies. In FATF, in this example. In the UK, we've done a bunch of work. One, we did some outreach to our members that fall under the definition of a VASP, virtual asset service provider, and we did a closed roundtable with the government, the folks in emerging risks and illicit finance department, to give them a flavour as to what the industry is doing. I can say from our anecdotal research is most of the players in the UK that are in scope have not solved for the travel rule at this stage. There's a number of reasons for that. We don't think the UK government is going to in the near future. That time horizon, I would suggest, will be at least 6 months, hopefully longer. Provide any requests to the UK VASP to implement anything. The UK has said in its recent consultation for stablecoins and other aspects of crypto that it's going to use this approach to wait and see what some of these intergovernmental agencies are going to do in regards to crypto regulation. So it's a wait and see approach, and we can dive into this later. It's not easy to solve for the travel rule, which in effect is just as a bank would have to have sender and beneficiary information provided between the two banks, in this case VASP. There's many issues regarding the ability to do this for virtual assets, which we can dive into shortly.
Absolutely. And Nathan, from your perspective, with your ex-regulator hat on, but also from what you're seeing in other jurisdictions, there are some jurisdictions, and one of the questions has come through, that don't adopt these particular regulations and continue as normal, and there are other jurisdictions that are very focused on getting these in place. What's your experience of the consultation process and implementation? What should the audience be aware of with reference to FATF guidance?
I guess, similar to what Ian mentioned earlier, the FATF set recommendations, so countries take some time to implement them, although in this case the recommendations are probably a bit stronger than that. If you don't implement the FATF recommendations, the consequences can be quite severe. You can get grey-listed, blacklisted, you can effectively be frozen out of the world economy. So there is that pressure for countries to comply. Again, that being said, there are certain countries that move faster than others. There are still jurisdictions right now that don't have any regulatory regime or framework for crypto assets on the AML-CFT side. But in our view, that's just something that's going to close over time. And when you have these new industries emerging and new regulatory frameworks popping up, it's normal that these things happen, and there's a certain level of regulatory arbitrage, at least for a few years. I do expect that to be closing. In terms of the UK, it's just interesting to point out that even though the FCA has not placed all of these businesses on the register, the legislation is live. So under the MLRs, as a crypto asset business, you need to be complying with AML-CFT legislation, irrespective of whether the FCA has added you to their list or not. So it's something, at least in the UK, that as a crypto business, you need to take very seriously, and you need to be operating as if you are already registered, even if you're waiting on the FCA to conclude on the registration process. So I think that's just something to bear in mind. And then again, going back to the travel rule, it's difficult. From a regulator perspective, the regulators are not usually the ones that set government policy or legislation. That's up to the politicians and the legislators to implement this stuff. So the travel rule will have to be legislated for in the UK. Normally, there's some sort of transitional period. So again, I think I kind of agree with Ian in the sense that it's probably going to be a few months away until any of this hits the statute books. and then there'll be a transition period until firms can actually or will need to comply with the travel rule. The issue with the travel rule is there's not many solutions out there right now, end-to-end solutions that will allow crypto companies to communicate and to share this data. So I know the industry has been working very hard. There's a number of providers out there that are getting very close. And personally, I do see this happening in a few months, but that's the main reason why jurisdictions have held off from implementing the travel rule, because there's no real technical way of actually doing so right now anyway. So you'll be legislating for something that's not really, there's not much point, because you won't be able to comply anyway.
And Nathan, from your perspective, how much risk is there for a UK VASP who's not implementing the travel rule from the long reach of an organisation like FinCEN, or if they've got if they've got a US presence? What risk is there?
I mean, this is the FATF referred to, it's called the sunrise problem. So there's going to be a situation where certain jurisdictions have legislated for the travel rule, and you might have VASPs complying with the travel rule on their end in their home jurisdiction, and other jurisdictions that haven't legislated for the travel rule yet. So that's something that's the FATF is well aware of the issue. Yeah. Personally, I mean, if you look at the US have quite an interesting approach, because in their view, crypto companies have always been money transmitters, even before the FATF updated their recommendations in 2018 to clarify that VASPs need to be regulated. So in their view, they've always been considered regulated businesses, and they've always had to comply with the travel rule effectively in their own way.
Yeah.
But if you think about what's happening in the US right now, again, there's VASPs operating in the US, but there's no travel rule solution as of yet. So even in the US right now, there's no. It's not really happening. To be blunt, I guess. Maybe give it a few months, and we'll see. We'll see the US ramp up. I know there's a few working groups in the US that are looking to develop some sort of solution, at least for US participants, and hopefully that would extend to other jurisdictions as well.
Definitely.
But
sorry, Claire, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a parallel to be drawn here actually with some of the rules which came in for trading derivatives. So this is what I'm thinking of are things such as the market and financial instruments number 2, when there was additional reporting on brokers and even the personnel. Now it seemed as highly intrusive, and it also was at odds with GDPR, though the FCA came out and said that MiFID, this particular piece of legislation, would override GDPR. And it was implemented, and it worked, including in the US, and also similarities with another piece of derivative regulation, EMIR, then the US version Dodd-Frank's. So I think what we can do is draw parallels from that and just say that it has been perfectly possible in other areas of non-traditional assets, so alternatives, to be able to find some common ground on reporting, which is, I say again, has similarities with the travel rule. So I think it can be implemented. I think you're absolutely right. It's a question of when, but until then, firms which are within the 5th Money Laundering Directive need to remember that they are within the FCA's perimeter. So they're already bound by a large number of rules which deal with counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering, and that's really at the heart of this. So although the travel rule may still be under discussion, I think that the 2 points to remember are that the Money Laundering Directive means you're in perimeter, so you have to comply with a lot. And then as far as sharing information and detail goes, we can see that has happened through other more existing regulation in the worlds of derivatives.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful guidance, Claire, for everyone that is listening. Just one perhaps last thing on FATF before we move on to more local legislation, and particularly the registration regime, which I know is a topic on a lot of people's minds at the moment. In the latest FATF draft guidance, NFTs that possibly facilitate money laundering and terrorist funding activities will be considered to be VASPs. So obviously, and they're significantly broadening the buckets that they're allowing to be defined as VASPs. As NFT becomes increasingly popular, and we've seen a huge amount of it going on in the news recently, certainly, are we actually seeing NFTs being used, Tom, for money laundering or other criminal behavior?
Sure. I'm still trying to understand why someone will pay $100,000 to $300,000 for a picture of a cat, let alone get the data around it. But absolutely, I mean, look, NFTs are obviously, I say obviously, but are quite new to the public as of such. And at the moment, there's no real data kind of collated. But what we have seen, and it was a little bit of a surprise to me, but you know, none of the major NFT trading venues, such as OpenSeas, for example, seem to be gathering KYC data for AML or CFT screening purposes. And I only found that out on an article on cryptonews.com. But what I would say is traditionally the art world is notorious for money laundering. So it wouldn't be too big of a stretch to think that, you know, NFTs might be used in similar kind of manner. But with the recent NFT boom, it has put NFTs on the FATF's radar, and the NFT sector would potentially be forced to follow guidelines similar to that of VAs and VASPs as well. And that's something I would, you know, absolutely expect. But certainly blockchain analytics would also be used to track transactions and identify participants. And, you know, let's say using the CryptoKitties example, where everything's built on Ethereum, ERC20 based, compliance naturally comes part of that conversation. So while things are still in their nascency and there's a couple of potential strategies in which illicit actors may use criminal NFTs for criminal behavior, I think the two scenarios that I potentially expect to see is to say, well, one of them is, well, if a known account with, say, large tax liabilities, they could potentially purchase an NFT from an unknown account. The known account may resell the NFT to a third account for a significantly lower price, and then realizing a loss that offsets, say, previous liabilities as well. As part of that, as you can imagine, they can, well, certainly the more savvy criminals can then take the crypto funds, cycle it through a service such as Tornado Cash to basically wash the crypto assets, or use a bankless exchange with very lax KYC and use money laundering NFT purposes in such a manner. But another way we might see it is, say, well, if you held, let's say, $1 million illicitly, you could also create an NFT, sell it to an unknown address, secretly yours for $1 million. And then through the use of coin mixes, you may then convert that $1 million into fiat and obscure the tie between your address and the real world, and then successfully laundering the $1 million there. So some of the NFT scams seen so far, we have seen, you know, replica store scams, counterfeit NFTs, artist impersonations, giveaways, airdrops, I suppose brand impersonations as well. So it is coming in, but some of what I'm seeing is really, I suppose, an evolution of how people were scamming people previously through typical internet scams, but just moving these onto the blockchain and using cryptocurrencies as part of that payment process.
Yeah, and I think that is certainly something that among the crypto community that we talk about quite a lot, and a question has come in, you know, these scams that aren't necessarily crypto related, but they are moved from the real world, if that's what we want to call it, from a newspaper or a telephone call or an email through to the crypto space, and they take advantage of inexperienced retail investors who perhaps aren't familiar with crypto. They don't know what questions to ask, as Ian mentioned earlier. So I guess we're left with the question in terms of the FATF guidance around NFTs, and are open to anyone on the panel really. Is the regulator's approach fit for purpose for NFTs, or is this going to sort of cripple, I guess, for want of a better turn of phrase, a blossoming market? And there's a lot of that interest that's happening today.
It's actually in a way been tackled by the FCA and the EU in MiCA, in the sense that the FCA has, if you think about an NFT being akin to a utility token, that type of thing. Well, they said that utility tokens aren't within the perimeter, or aren't necessarily, but of course with all these things you have to look at the details, and it could well be that, you know, because some NFTs may actually fall within the e-money regulations. Again, it's a bit unlikely, but it is possible. But at the same time, MiCA did say that they were going to add NFTs, or add utility tokens rather, to their European regulation. Now it's good few years before that comes in. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that, you know, we've seen, as Tom was saying, we've seen a more sudden sort of boom in NFTs. And I think the problem here is that everything is moving a bit too quickly for the regulators to catch up with. You know, the idea that utility tokens would be absolutely fine, and if they weren't, they were covered by e-money. We're now seeing something new happening, like, you know, pictures of cats, or, you know, the first Bitcoin trade ever sent, you know, or so on, how much they're worth. So there's always going to be that sort of push-pull between the two, and the market is going to work faster. So I have to say, you need the wisdom of Solomon as a regulator to work on this one, to give consumer protection, but still allow the flourishing of valid commerce in the financial services sector.
Definitely, it's a very difficult balance to strike, and I think as we look towards more local legislation, and perhaps a prime example of that is the FCA registration regime and its impact on innovation and job creation and UK PLC, as there are over 200 firms today who are still waiting on that list. Ian, you recently published an open letter to the government, highlighting the challenges of those companies stuck on that list. From your perspective and representing the trade body, what do you have to say with reference to the experience of being on the registration regime?
Any new regime is challenging, and we know that the FCA takes its remit to carry out the powers given to it by the government to protect consumer. Consumer risks are increasing. As mentioned, the amount of money coming into crypto is exponential. You know, just looking at NFTs recently, it's just exploded in the last 6 months. And to go back to the discussion around that, I was somewhat surprised that FATF mentioned that in their recent guidance released a few weeks ago. But then, thinking about it a bit deeper, the numbers coming in from say a number of celebrities that are looking to tokenize their offerings, whatever they may be, art, music, sports stars, would be bothering me if I was a regulator, because there are avenues that people will exploit, just like in any industry. But to focus on the UK and the regime, yes, our letter was really just to shine a light on the fact that it's very difficult for businesses to really get anywhere. We are seeing many questions coming from the regulator, a lot of frustration, and obviously you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't if you're the regulator, because there's so much downside risk if they say do issue a license, and then they take on their face if this particular crypto businesses was funneling money from North Korea, for example. However, we do want to see some movement. It's at that point now where the risk is of companies leaving the UK. We're hearing this quite a lot, and also it makes the UK look somewhat not as an attractive as a place to come and do business if you're in the fintech sector. And we know the UK has a great pedigree for this industry and financial services generally. So we're at that tipping point, let's say, where there's a lot of regulatory risk and jurisdictional risk for businesses coming to the UK. So hopefully we can work with all the relative stakeholders as an industry, and the industry does work hard to try and solve these problems. And going back to the travel rule, there's a number of initiatives that have been spun up by the private sector to try and address the issues, whether that be messaging standards or TRISA, which has 150 members looking to develop solutions. There are a lot of working groups trying to support but it is a problem, especially when the deadline is coming in the beginning of July, similar to the end of last year for the temporary regime for those grandfathered in businesses that are trading. We're sort of back to square one, because legally these companies would have to close up shop, and that's quite a few businesses, over 100 on this temporary register, that would have to leave the UK effectively, or stop trading completely.
Yeah. And this is actually one of the questions from the audience. What does the panel foresee, and maybe open to you or anyone indeed, what do we foresee another extension as the deadline approaches for those companies that were grandfathered in but have not yet been approved? Or do you think there will be a stopping point where the industry simply says, or excuse me, the regulator simply says to the industry, well, you need to go and set up shop elsewhere?
Well, the FCA is quite often extended, hasn't it? In other regulations it's implemented, it's taken a more sort of pragmatic approach and said, as long as you've made the application and you're acting as if you are regulated, then you can carry on. So judged on past performance, I wouldn't be surprised if that did happen. But yeah. I mean, Ian, what you've spent a lot of time talking to the regulator, don't you?
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, what was the specific question?
Sorry, we were just asking, in terms of the time you spend talking to the regulator, have they given an indication, or are they being quite playing it close to the chest as to what happens when the deadline approaches?
No, we don't get. Well, we ask the question naturally, but we don't get a response. The only responses you'll see from the regulator, what they publish on their own channels. So, for example, when we obviously did a lot of advocacy with both the HMT and Her Majesty's Treasury. Obviously, is the legislator, writes the policy, and the FCA just has the powers to enforce it. That's all they can do. Although that said, there's another whole discussion around new powers being given to the FCA, and that's a whole other discussion around checks and balances. And we're working with many people in the legal profession to try and address that. We believe there should be greater transparency around decisions that the regulator makes that haven't been granted to it in our constitution. However, I digress. But to answer the question, nope, we don't get anything direct from them. We do ask. All we know is that one of the reasons they gave for the difficulty in processing applications on their public release in December was regarding COVID and the inability to physically visit companies' premises, which makes sense. And we also know from many discussions that resources within the FCA have been stretched because of the pandemic, for example, loan schemes to support vulnerable folks. The increased scams has pulled resources from different teams across the regulator. The number of applications, 200 versus the original forecast of 80. It's great for UK PLC, but again, a resourcing issue. And also from the industry, let's be honest, that the number of these applications are coming from folks that haven't been under a regulatory regime previously. So you can imagine a bunch of guys that are tech savvy, that develop a software solution, and they build a really good product, that have no experience as to how to comply to this regulatory regime, and then also roll into that the perceived risks are at the FCA of terrorist finance and money laundering in crypto is really, really high. And so they are looking at each application with a real minutiae, and it's somewhat of a regime that is perhaps overstepping originally what it was set up for, which is a specific activity. That's what we're hearing from the community. But I think if you're the regulator, you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't. You can't win because, as I said, if the potential downside risk is so great. However, it's a balance between, and this is what we said in our open letter, between fostering competition in the UK, allowing these new innovative businesses to operate, and if it doesn't get solved soon and more applications do get granted, then these businesses will go elsewhere. And still sell the services in the UK. And so the harm to the UK consumers will still continue without any regulatory oversight. So we don't want that either. That's a catch-22.
Yeah, as an ex-regulator, I completely sympathise with what the FCA are probably going through. I mean, when we were establishing the regime in Gibraltar, it was a challenge. And especially on the point you made on previously unregulated businesses moving into the regulated sector. I mean, it is quite a steep learning curve, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to meet these standards. I mean, the money laundering regime is this is financial services regulation and legislation that these firms are are having to comply with. They're having to implement similar controls that banks and other financial institutions need to be implementing. So I do sympathize, maybe because I'm an ex-regulator, I do sympathize with their position. But yeah, I do also see that there is this need to at least make a decision. I mean, if the reason why some firms are not being added to the register is because they aren't meeting the standards, then they should be rejected. And the ones that are could have that certainty and continue to do business. So yeah, I guess it depends on without actually being in the FCA, it's difficult to really understand what the delays are. I mean, if it is a capacity issue, then I wouldn't be surprised if they just extended the deadline again.
Yeah.
But if there are firms that are being held back because they're failing to meet requirements, it could get to a point that the FCA just draws a line and starts making rejections.
I think a lot of people actually do want to be regulated. A lot of people, it's important to them that they are. It's important to their business. The issue is making sure the regulation is correct and it does help their business rather than stifle innovation. So that, that's another sort of fairly tricky thing. I know the FCA in the past have, with Part 4 applications, said to people, the aim is to help you get through, not to just say no. Whether that's happening with the money laundering registration, I don't know, but I think, as you're saying, I think the understaffing, and also it's a new area, so there is a lack of experience and a full number of experienced people within the FCA. I think that's also an issue, but I think anybody should sort of try and get some help on it to get through, because they do every bit of it, don't they?
No, sorry, Claire. It just is a perfect storm. Every which way you look at it, it's a new technology. It requires a deep level of research to fully understand. The business models can be complex. The legal entities are complex for some of these businesses because they're multi-jurisdictional and they have to have separate legal entities for touching crypto versus touching fiat currency. And so it is difficult. And roll into that, Brexit, roll into that, COVID, roll into that. What we've already spoken about. So and also then you have to add to all of that the fact that just because somebody isn't regulated or isn't regulated yet, it doesn't mean that they're actually outside every other area of law. So tax evasion, fraud, criminality, misrepresentation, all these things still apply to people conducting activities in the UK, whether they're regulated or not. So the regulation also has to make sure it meshes in, with all of that. And anybody who's in that area has to remember that just because they're not regulated, they're not suddenly outside every single bit of God.
Absolutely. And I think you raised an interesting point there, Claire, in terms of fighting crypto crime. It's obviously a key part of both succeeding as a crypto business altogether and also achieving compliance, whether that be, FATF or the FCA regime, etc. Companies need to demonstrate that they are able to prevent and detect crypto crime in order to comply. And we're interested to know some questions from the audience around what advice would the panel give to UK-based crypto businesses looking to detect and prevent crypto crime? Tom, obviously this is a space with which you're very familiar and very passionate, I know. In terms of your perspective, what does that look like for businesses?
So around the regulatory piece, I think what we've all kind of understood is regulation is forever evolving, and what we do have are ultimately guidelines, and the question of what does that mean to me? How do I implement it always comes about. And so I can't give direct advice, but what I can tell you is the people and the customers that I work with, certainly the most successful VASPs will always self-regulate themselves. And by doing that, it doesn't matter whether you're a startup or a mature organization, they understand that compliance isn't a necessary evil and a spend that you have to have in place. It's actually a business enabler that allows you, certainly in the UK, to get your full license to continue operating, retain your customers, and obviously grow and acquire new ones as well as part of that. But alongside that is actually then looking at, well, how can we be more proactive around regulating ourselves? And so one of the biggest problems when these more mature and successful VASPs look into it is say, well, look, the way they're doing AML at the moment is ultimately relying on, say, public and private blacklists, which is all well and good. But the issue that we have in the crypto space is relying on those blacklists is ultimately relying on a known address that's already conducted criminal activity turning up on your platform. And so if we can understand that criminals are getting smarter, NFT technology is moving quicker, and we can accept that at a click of a button, someone like you or I, or a criminal, can ultimately create thousands of wallets that go untagged on and will never be part of a blacklist. We need to look into that and understand where that risk is. And that's the only way that I've seen, certainly the most successful VASPs in the UK and ultimately globally as well, demonstrate to regulators that as much as it's a little bit gray and you're giving us guidelines, we're actually doing everything we can to go beyond blacklists, go beyond what we're doing now to actually, certainly, provide a successful and certainly secure crypto ecosystem in the UK, at least anyway.
Absolutely. And Nathan, from a regulatory perspective, how do you see that AML and other legislation that is looking to prevent illicit activities evolving, and what would be your guidance to companies in terms of preventing that crypto crime from happening?
Yeah, I think I'd also have to say that self-regulation at this stage is quite important. If you look at the direction of travel, again, the focus over the past few years has been very much on money laundering, terrorist financing, but it does seem to be shifting, and there are other regulatory touch points that you're going to have to be considering as a crypto business. And if you look at the EU framework, for example, the markets in crypto assets framework, that doesn't even consider AML at all. This is a full regime that covers prudential requirements, customer conduct. There's a full regime on issuance of tokens. So, I mean, crypto companies, it can be painful to have to bring in these frameworks in place, but sorry to say, but there's only more regulation coming. But again, look, as Tom points out, I think if you comply properly and you really take a step back and you implement these frameworks, not looking to tick boxes, but looking to implement something that is effective and that really covers the risks that you're exposed to, that's when you're going to get the most value out of these compliance programs. And with FATF and AML regulation, a lot of it is actually quite principles based, and it's very much focused on having a risk-based approach to AML, CFT. There's a lot of discretion in terms of when you have to apply enhanced due diligence, for example, other than a few key things such as PEPs. But if you really set out your compliance framework effectively to address the high risk exposures, you're only protecting yourself as a business. Where compliance can get very costly is when you have entities looking to adopt like a tick box approach, and overdoing it on low risk customers and maybe not doing enough on their high risk customers, and that's where you can really get caught out. And you have these huge fines of banks not complying with the regulatory frameworks properly and letting people through the net effectively.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think, yeah, it is an incredibly complicated challenge. And I think, as you say, the self-regulation model is probably the one that will put our audience and other companies in a best position. Claire, do you have any guidance in terms of, particularly in terms of crime prevention or compliance for companies, perhaps who are just starting out?
Well, I think there are two things I'd say. The first is, get advice and act as if you are regulated, because if you do that, then you've got the right systems and everything in place. And also, when you become regulated, if you were to need to become regulated later, you can demonstrate to the FCA in your Part 4 application that you knew exactly what you're up to when you were running that type ship from the word go. And the second thing I would say is listen to what the FCA has been saying most recently this year, particularly with the new Board of Appointments, which is that they're going to take a much more holistic view on this and look at governance and culture. So as Nathan was saying, there's no point in having a system in place if you just say, yeah, tick a box, job done. The FCA will expect everybody to have to start at the governance and culture point, because then it feeds into and builds the compliant systems that are needed. And the regulator is actually your friend. They want this to work, and they want to work with you to make it work. So get some professional advice, act as if you are regulated, and make sure you've got those compliance and culture lines of defence in place.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we see quite often is younger companies who are just coming into market, who are looking for that guidance. Where can they find that guidance? It's obviously quite a complicated issue, but are there resources available? What would the panel suggest in terms of where they seek that guidance from?
Well, I have to say me, actually, if I could, a shameless plug there. But, I think it's fairly hard to find it all in one place. So, solicitors probably useful, but also, CryptoUK produces, Ian, you can talk about the stuff you produce, but it's so useful.
Thank you. Yeah, I would, if folks want to find out more, then join our social media. Also sign up for our newsletter. We keep the community abreast of any changes, and we do get a lot of questions regarding, are we in scope? And there's lots of different business models where you could argue the case that yes you are or no you're not, and it depends on a number of factors. So we're happy to receive any requests for any information, and we will direct you to the right areas.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. So we've almost run out of time, unfortunately. It's been a really interesting conversation. That we had one question that had come through from the panel that is perhaps a little different from what we've been talking about, but certainly a challenge for UK companies or companies looking to set up in the UK. At the moment, it is incredibly difficult to secure a banking relationship in the UK, whilst financial institutions have been putting crypto on a risk list and disregarding the FATF's guidance that banks should not apply a blanket denial of service, but rather conduct their own risk assessments. Is there anything that the panel can speak to about what the industry could potentially do, and any guidance the panel can give in terms of companies that are looking to secure banking services in the UK?
Should I have a quick stab at this as something close to my heart, and we did mention this in our open letter to the Chancellor. I guess somebody should set up a crypto bank. If anybody would like to help me do that, then please reach out. Good luck with getting a banking license from the FCA for a bank that banks crypto. Well, there's two ways of looking at this. Firstly, do the incumbents, the high street banks, have the risk appetite? No, we know they don't. One, because the FCA wrote a letter to all the CEOs of the UK high street banks in 2018, effectively saying if you're going to bank any crypto businesses, then you need to do super duper mega enhanced due diligence. So the risk appetite was, we're not going to touch them. Is the additional profit from the costs involved, is that commercially viable? Probably not. Let's assume the current regime for crypto businesses falling under KYC and AML, once this is clear at some point this year, hopefully everything will be fine. Would that change the risk appetite? I would hope so, but many still think that the cost benefit analysis just outweighs that. There are a number of businesses that are crypto friendly. I don't want to single out any names here, but there's half a dozen. If anybody is struggling, please reach out to us at CryptoUK, and we can make introductions or suggest those payment rails, service providers, or actual banks with a crypto-friendly policy that are supporting the industry. But there's few in the UK. The US is ahead of the game for sure, and we would like to see some improvements here.
We are very sadly out of time, guys. Thank you so much to all of our panelists who have joined and all of the attendees. As I mentioned at the top of the call, we will be sending out an email which has the recording, which has the contact details for all of our panelists, which has the UK Crypto Regulations Guide that's been prepared by Cummings, Pepperdine and Merkle Science. And we will obviously be producing more content, more webinars like this on RegWatch from Merkle Science. So look forward to seeing you all on another occasion. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.